Greg, when I think about God, I try to discern what are the things about God that makes God God. And when you look at God creating the universe and things we're familiar with, the question of time always looms up on almost anything that you do. And the two arguments, one is that God is in time or God is outside of time. So temporal or timeless. Hot arguments on both sides among people who believe almost everything else the same. On this, they disagree. What are the arguments on both sides?
Well, probably the strongest argument that God is in time is that it's the only way God can know what's happening now. Now, to frame the argument that way, it assumes that there is a real thing called the now, and that's different than the past or the future. And that in order for God to know every true fact, God has to know what's happening now. And if time really works this way, if the fundamental shape of time, so to speak, is past, present, and future, and of course what's present changes. So God would have to know different things at different times. So right now he knows we're having this conversation, but tomorrow he'll know they had the conversation yesterday. So what God knows changes. And of course, if there's change, then there's before and after, and God is in time.
So now this seems like a very common feeling because we all feel that time.
Yes.
People want to believe in a God that they relate to, so they're praying or they're saying, God help me or whatever.
Right.
And so God is theoretically their God that they're worshiping. God is in time in that sense. So that's sort of a common perception, but that's not the way that many traditional theologians have thought about it.
Right, that's right. And the people who argue that God's outside time are going to say, in response to this particular argument, that what it means that something is happening now can be understood without reference to what you could call a privileged position. And in this way, they argue that time is much more like space. So if I say to you, I am sitting here, and you say to me, no, you're sitting there, we're not really disagreeing, because here and there are relative locations in space, and nobody really thinks there's a privileged location in space, and everything else is there, but there's a real here. So God wouldn't have to be in space to know what's happening here, because what's happening here is cashed out or analyzed or understood in terms of other spatial locations. And so theologians and philosophers who think that God is outside time think that all of these facts about what's happening now are facts that can be understood without reference to something that changes.
Something before or after something else.
That's right. It's more what's happening now is simultaneous with all of these things. Or sometimes they cash it out in terms of the now, the word now refers to a time. It's like a referential term, like the pronoun I, the pronoun you. When I say I am sitting here, you wouldn't say, no, I'm sitting over here, right? Because
who's the I?
Who's the I? It changes referent in different uses.
Now, arguments for God being outside of time, there are at least two. Yes. One is the ancient idea that to be perfect, God would have to be out of time. This is a perfection. Because if God were in time, he would be subject to the overarching power of time as something above God, which would ruin his sovereignty, so to speak, or he would lose the direct experience of the past, or he would not have the future, so God would have less of a fullness of experience.
Right.
And it's also supported, some would say scientifically, by the Einsteinian revolution of space and time being the same in a so-called block universe where space and time are sort of always there in a four-dimensional sense.
That's right, because if time and space really are tied together this way, then just like the universe of space came into existence, the universe of time came into existence. And even if you want to argue that time and space are not the same this way, if you believe time came into existence, it didn't exist everlastingly, then God would be outside time, at least before creation happened. Yeah, before the creation of time. But most philosophers think that if God brings time into existence along with space and along with objects, stars, planets, toads, and things like this, that God is outside of time, because time itself is one of the creations of God. And so many people think that relativity theory supports God being outside time.
So do you have to take one of those two positions? Either God created time and therefore God was at least explanatorily prior to time, or time is everlasting and God is everlasting in a timeless reality in which time, in essence, is co-temporaneous with God and in some way equal with God.
Or you wouldn't say equal, but you would say time is one of the facets of God's experience. So we have other properties of God that we think are part of God in some sense, like God being knowing. Just like God is knowing, God would be temporal. It would be an aspect of what God is like if God is temporal.
So in that case, you would say that time emerges out of God. Some people like to say that, like abstract objects, numbers, which people who believe in God don't like to have floating around independent of God, because that makes God less powerful, less sovereign.
Right.
If the number 7 is just out there and God just exists and happens to be surrounded by numbers and logic, that God is swimming in the sea of abstract objects, theists don't like that.
Right. They tend to be divine conceptualists, that logic and mathematics is the way
of God. So time would be the same thing.
Time would be something like that.
Okay. So what are the criticisms of God being in time?
The criticisms of God being in time, well, some of them have to do with knowledge of the future. Can God know what we're going to do tomorrow and that still be free? If God is outside of time, then his knowing it is not really before when we do it. And many people, traditionally and contemporaneously, think that helps to solve this question.
So the paradox between God knowing the future and free will, some people say can be partially solved if you bring God outside of time.
Exactly. Because God is not knowing things ahead of time. The problem is, if I'm going to freely choose to have a cup of coffee tomorrow, and God believed 10,000 years ago that I was not going to choose coffee, can I change God's past beliefs? But if God's beliefs aren't in the past, then God knows, the word you used was co-temporaneously, which is a good word, with my choosing coffee. Then God's eternal knowledge of what I will do does not inhibit the freedom. So that's how that would be answered.
So when you reflect on God being in time or outside of time, first, how important do you think that is? Is this just a couple of late night bull sessions that people have, or is it important in understanding who or what this God is that some people would have us believe is the ground of all reality?
Well, I might be different than a lot of people on this. I think anything we can learn about God is worth doing and important for that. But of all the issues, this might have the least effect in terms of how we ought to live our lives if we want to be religious people, if we want to try to follow God or make God an important part of our life. There are much more important attributes of God in terms of God's love or God's knowledge or God's power, or whether God is knowable, whether God has revealed himself. These things all seem to me to be more important. And most thinkers can agree about all of those and still disagree, as you said, about the God in time question.
Here's the problem I would have with that if you cannot build a coherent story about all those other things by understanding God's relationship to time, then maybe I should question all the others as well. That unless you can build a coherent story that's internally consistent about the God you want me to believe in, I'm not willing to go with you on the things that you would have me go.
Now, I would agree with you about that. I think we have to try to come up with a coherent story about what God is like. And that's why we're philosophers.